The sports you love, the teams you can't live without.
Get a sense of urgency!
This is Jake Scott and Ben Anderson on 97.5 The KSL Sports Zone.
Jake and Ben, 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone. Jake Scott, Ben Anderson, of course, Utah State continues to be in the news for basically all the wrong reasons. Let's get out of the zone phone. Joining us now, he makes the magic happen for ESPN, and he's recently written about the Utah State situation. He's Dan Murphy with us here on Jake and Ben. Dan, thank you very much for a few minutes. How's it going?
Good. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. How are we doing today?
We're doing well. Dan, how does this story compare to other dismissals of head coaches you've seen of, I guess, I don't want to say something similar to this ilk. It's an ugly backstory, but how have you seen these play out historically?
Yeah, it is. None are exactly alike, but there's always a point where things get really complicated and technical in the weeds, I think, with these. And there are several other examples of coaches who are let go for non-football reasons, who are then kind of arguing and saying, "Oh, you're just sort of creating a reason to fire me so that you don't have to pay my buyout." And I think in that case, we've seen a handful of these, and oftentimes it gets dragged out into court for a little while, and then the two sides reach some kind of a settlement and can somehow shake hands and walk away from it.
So, do you think this is different than that, and how?
I don't know. I don't want to predict too far. I don't believe that Blake Anderson has even sort of filed a lawsuit yet, but it is, certainly an interesting story. Trying to sort through some of the facts of what exactly Blake Anderson did as a result of sort of finding out that one of his players had been arrested, and where and if he crossed any lines with things that you're clearly should not be doing as a coach when a player gets into this kind of trouble.
I think one of my questions with this is it's obviously difficult when a coach is responsible for suspending players or has to make some of that determination. And I get it. They are kind of these players' handlers. They get them on campus. Sometimes they are a lifeline for these players, so they want to be involved. But also there's this conflict of interest where coaches are going to look out for their jobs, and sometimes suspending players is not in the best interest of your job. It's just, as ugly as that sounds, we know college football can be ugly, and it feels like that gets wrapped up in this sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, in this particular case, Blake Anderson was fired. The school argued that he learned that a player was arrested for a domestic violence issue and then went and tried to sort of investigate it himself. And for a lot of reasons, that's a very clear line that you're not supposed to cross as a coach when you have an issue between a player and a woman that, you don't even want the perception that as a coach that you might somehow be influencing how this woman is responding in what could be a criminal matter. And then, Anderson's version of that is that he found out one of his players was in trouble with the police and he didn't know why. And as you said, it was between him and the athletic director, their shared responsibility to decide whether or not to suspend this player. And they wanted a little bit more information to learn why the police had even shown up at the player's apartment before making a decision. And it puts him in a pretty tough spot. So there's a little bit of disagreement of facts where the school says that he knew it was a domestic violence issue before he hopped in. And Anderson says that's not the case, which is, again, where we said this kind of thing can get into the weeds pretty quickly. That I think is probably the important distinction of this case. But to your larger point, I do think it's a tricky scenario for coaches across the country right now to try to navigate. And I'm interested to see as college sports continues to evolve and gets a little bit more professional, if there are other ways that schools go about thinking through how to run that discipline process to avoid some of the conflicts that you brought up.
Can you read into anything, or is it troubling at all, do you think, that it took so long?
No, I think in my, I cover a lot of this stuff for ESPN, and especially when there are police and actual criminal cases involved, the pace these things move at is always incredibly slow. And then Utah State hired a big white shoe law firm called Hush Blackwell that does a lot of this kind of work for universities to come in and do an investigation. And, part of that is they're going to be very thorough, and part of it, those lawyers get paid by the hour. So these things always drag on for months and months. It's always a little surprising to me how long these things take to play out. But I think in the long run, the school looked at it and said, we need to make sure we cover ourselves here, and especially if we're going to try to fire him without paying any of his buyout. So, this is probably the pace these things normally move at.
How does the timing impact Utah State? This is obviously very late in the offseason, as it will bleed in with this 30-day transfer portal window now for these players to when camp is going to be open early next month. How does that change, and how does it compare to other times these types of dismissals have happened in the past?
Yeah, that part of it is tough for sure. 2 weeks, 3 weeks before teams are getting together for training camp certainly makes it hard. And I don't know to what degree, certainly by July 2nd, when the school first put out notice that they were putting the coach on leave with an intent to get rid of him, I think it was pretty clear. I'm sure that the coaches were, the remaining assistant coaches were able to talk to the players and let them know, hey, we're probably not going to get Coach Anderson back. I don't know how much he knew before July 1st or July 2nd what his long-term status was with the team, but certainly a tough situation for the players to lose a coach like that and have to make a tough decision when, even if they wanted to leave Utah State, there probably aren't many landing spots and roster availability spots left for players as everyone else gets ready to get ready for camp at this point too.
And I'm sorry to ask you to almost speculate about this because it's an ugly situation, and the details that have come out were that the player ended up getting fined a little less than $700. He had grabbed his girlfriend's sweatshirt and it choked her. I think everyone's lucky that the victim wasn't more harmed in this situation. What do you make of Blake Anderson's future and hireability, I guess, after this type of dismissal? Because this is obviously an enormous push in our country right now to eliminate this type of violence.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's dangerous to get too far into what exactly happened here because, there are very few people that actually know those details. I think a good part of the reason, obviously Blake Anderson is fighting this publicly because he wants to get some of that contract buyout that he's owed. But I would imagine that he's 55, 56 years old. He was a rising star in coaching not long ago, especially after his first year with the Aggies. I would imagine a good portion of his motivation in fighting this so publicly and potentially filing a lawsuit is more about protecting his reputation and trying to get his version of the story out there publicly so that he can set himself up for the next job and not have some type of scarlet letter. I would think I don't know, but I would imagine that he could probably, especially some of the success he's had offensively in his career, find a school where if he's willing to sort of explain here's how this happened. I've learned my lesson. That would happily hire him as an offensive coordinator. I don't think this is a you'll never coach again kind of situation. I'm trying to think. One of the stories we covered in the last year was Mel Tucker at Michigan State, which was another sort of sexual misconduct situation. But that one was more clearly he's going to be really hard to hire in the future. I don't think that's the case here with Blake Anderson. I think it seems like he made a mistake here, but it wasn't like he was directly involved in some form of sexual misconduct, and probably not something. It's probably something he'd be able to recover from if he handles it properly.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for jumping on with us. We really appreciate it. Want to send everybody your great story, ESPN.com, about this situation, and thanks for coming on and explaining it to our listeners.
Thanks, guys.